The chamber smelled like recycled coolant and old institutional fear. Assessor Drevak Sorn had presided over 17 weapons hearings in this room, and the smell never changed. A mix of seal compound, Kaldrathi body chemistry, and the particular flat odor of forms printed on recycled polymer. He found it calming. The room had witnessed the orderly resolution of disorder. It would do so again today. The human sat on the opposite side of the table, with her hands folded in front of her, not on the table itself, but just below the edge, which meant he could not actually see what she was doing with them. He noticed this with mild, professional unease, and let it pass. She wore the standard issue gray fatigues of a human auxiliary contract soldier, rank patches removed pending review, name tape still in place. Kowalski, I.A. The fabric at her left shoulder showed a lighter patch where something had been removed recently. Stitching marks, clean cuts, knot wear. Something had been taken off her, not fallen off. He noted this also. She did not look hostile. She did not look worried. She looked, Drevak thought, like someone waiting for a transport that was running 6 minutes late, mildly inconvenienced, fully prepared to continue waiting. He spread the incident report across the table. She did not lean forward to read it. She already knew what it said. Auxiliary Kowalski, he began. You understand why you're here. Because the Commission classified my sidearm as a prohibited munitions delivery system, she said. Yes. Because the weapon you carried during active duty on Terran Station was not issued by the Galactic Auxiliary Supply Directorate, was not cataloged in the Unified Armaments Registry, and was constructed, according to the investigation report, from salvaged components including, but not limited to, a thermal cycling unit from a food service appliance, 17 centimeters of medical-grade titanium tubing, and a percussion actuator from a communications terminal that had been decommissioned 5 standard years prior. She waited a moment. Is that a question? The edge of Drevak's secondary eyelid twitched. He smoothed it over. The Vraxian consul to the Auxiliary Commission filed a formal protest. Your weapon, and I use that term with some flexibility, caused what his filing describes as a unilateral escalation of kinetic response parameters beyond the scope of the Joint Engagement Framework. His exact phrasing. I read the filing, she said. And? He spelled parameters wrong. The forms in front of Drevak did not move. He stared at them for a moment, ensuring they would not, then looked back at the human. The weapon has been confiscated. You are aware. I'm aware. The Commission would like to understand how it came to exist, since the official auxiliary weapons log shows your issued sidearm, a standard GR7 plasma carbine, was rendered inoperable on the 4th day of the Taran Station engagement, approximately 11 standard days before the engagement concluded. That's correct. Which means you operated for 11 days in an active hostile environment without an authorized weapon. She appeared to consider whether this required a response. She decided it did not. Drevak pressed. Auxiliary Kowalski, the GR7 you were issued was destroyed. We have the damage report. We also have records of your engagement activity during the 11 days following that event, which suggest you were not, in fact, operating without effective combat capability. He paused. The filing from the Vraxian consul specifically mentions you were the anchor element of 3 separate defensive actions during that period. Anchor element, not support. Anchor. Yes. The weapon we confiscated had a range of approximately 80 meters, a cycling rate of 4 rounds per 6 seconds, and could punch through the carapace plate of a Scraith combat drone at standard engagement distances. He looked up from the report. This is not a food appliance. No, she agreed. It's a weapon I built from a food appliance. Drevak set down the form. He had been holding it for the last 40 seconds because having something physical in his hands was a useful habit during unusual hearings. And this had become, in the last 3 minutes, an unusual hearing. He folded his upper set of fingers together and his lower set beneath the table, which was his version of careful. "Walk me through it," he said. "From the beginning." She unfolded her hands and placed them on the table. They were very still. He noticed the knuckles, slightly enlarged on the dominant hand, the kind of thickening that came from years of impact work, not from injury. The smaller scars at her wrist were old, well healed. None of this was in the intake form, which listed her prior service as administrative logistics. He made a note to look at the full service record later, under the assumption that whatever was actually in it would surprise him. "The GR7 took a proximity burst on day 4, she said. "Housing cracked, power cell vented. I stripped it for components and handed what was left to the supply clerk because the frame was still rated for cannibalization. What I kept was the targeting site, because it was optically intact and not part of the issue log." A pause. "The site was mine. I bought it on Keller's Rock between deployments." "Understood." Terran Station is a logistics hub, Level 4 transit node. It has 17 different service corridors, a full catering operation for the transit population, 2 medical bays, emergency communications, and a recycling facility that processes everything from food waste to decommissioned equipment. She said this the way someone reads a manifest, each item given equal weight, nothing emphasized. The Scrith came in through the transit docking arms on day 2. By day 4, they had the eastern service corridors and were pushing toward the main concourse. "We have the tactical overview," Drevak said. "Then you know there were 4,600 civilian transients in the main concourse," she said. "And that there were 9 auxiliary personnel total on station, including me." He knew. He had read this portion of the report with what he privately categorized as mounting professional alarm. 9 personnel. 4,600 civilians. The engagement had lasted 15 days total. At the end of it, all 4,600 civilians had been evacuated alive. This statistic had been in the report in plain text, and he had still had to read it twice. "What I didn't have," Kowalski continued, "was a weapon. What I did have was station access, 11 days, and a recycling bay that had not yet been reached by Scrith." She looked at the tabletop with the particular expression of someone reconstructing a sequence of events they have already reconstructed many times for their own purposes, not for an audience. The thermal cycling unit from the catering system runs at pressures between 800 and 1200 kilopascals during normal operation. The release valve is spring actuated, normally used to bleed excess pressure during maintenance. If you replace the spring with a percussion actuator from a comms unit and modify the release aperture to accept the titanium tubing, which comes in 17 centimeter standard lengths from the medical supply bay because it's used for structural reinforcement in emergency triage equipment, you have a compressed gas projector that cycles at roughly 4 rounds per 6 seconds if you feed it appropriately shaped projectiles. Drevak was quiet for a moment. "Appropriately shaped projectiles," he repeated. "The recycling facility processes Scrith drone carapace fragments. The material is extremely hard, irregular in shape, but the recycling equipment grades it into size categories before processing. The fragments in the 4 to 6 centimeter range were the right size and dense enough to maintain velocity at 80 meters. The secondary eyelid twitched again. Drevak did not smooth it over this time. "You built a weapon," he said slowly, "out of a food appliance, medical tubing, and pieces of the enemy." She did not appear to find this remarkable. The components were available. The threat was present. The math wasn't complicated. Dravak stood, walked 2 steps to the narrow window that overlooked the station's secondary corridor, and stood there for a moment. This was not standard procedure during a weapons hearing. He was aware of this. He did it anyway. Outside, a Solvathi maintenance crew was running diagnostics on the corridor lighting array, their bioluminescent skins cycling through their species' calm work pattern, a steady, slow blue. He watched them until he had something like his composure back. The Vraxian consul's protest, he said, still facing the window, was filed on the grounds that your improvised weapon represented an unauthorized modification of the engagement framework, that it fell outside the joint rules of engagement because it was not a cataloged system. Yes. The commission agreed with his framing. I know. He turned around. She was watching him with that expression again. The transport is late expression, unhurried, fully present. Do you contest the commission's ruling? I contest the framing, she said, not the ruling. He came back to the table and sat. Explain. She shifted slightly in the chair, one precise adjustment for what appeared to be a mild complaint from her lower back, then settled. The Joint Engagement Framework governs cataloged auxiliary weapons. The GR-7 I was issued was cataloged. When it was destroyed, I no longer had a cataloged weapon. The framework applies to what I was issued. It doesn't apply to what I built because what I built was never in the framework to begin with. A pause. The consul's argument requires the commission to extend the framework's scope to cover improvised weapons assembled from non-military components in an unauthorized location during an active engagement. That's not an extension. That's a rewrite. Dravak looked at the form again, at the weapon photograph paperclipped to the back of the form, a dense, compact assembly of tubes and fasteners and repurposed housing panels, heavy at the rear where the modified pressure chamber sat, narrow at the front where the tubing ran to a bored-out aperture, the sight mounted high on a bracket she had apparently fashioned from the GR-7's shattered forward rail, a secondary trigger looped with insulated wire to what looked like a modified food-safe pressure gauge so she could monitor cycling rate without looking at the mechanism. It was ugly in the specific way that things built to work rather than to be seen were ugly. It was also clearly a weapon. Clearly, and without any ambiguity, a weapon. The commission's concern, he said carefully, is precedent. If the framework does not govern improvised weapons, then technically any auxiliary personnel in any situation could construct any device from any available components and claim it falls outside the rules of engagement. The consul's office argues this creates an unacceptable gap. Yes, she said, you agree with the consul's concern. I agree there's a gap. I disagree that the solution is to ban improvisation. She looked at him with that steady, unemphatic directness. Assessor Sorn. I had 9 people, 4,600 civilians, and a Scraith pushed through the eastern corridors. The gap in the framework is not that humans might build weapons from food appliances. The gap is that the framework was written for engagements where authorized equipment functions, supply lines exist, and the situation is recoverable without improvisation. And Terran Station was not that situation. Terran Station was a situation where the framework had already failed before I needed the weapon, she said. The Scraith got through the docking arms because the standard response protocol assumed an auxiliary response time of 4 hours. We were 9 people on a transit hub. 4 hours was the time it would take the Scraith to reach the civilian concourse. The faintest shift in her expression then, something that went through her face too quickly to be read clearly. I wasn't going to sit in a storage bay with a broken carbine and wait to find out if the framework eventually caught up with the situation. Drivak looked at the weapon photograph for a long time. He thought about the 4,600 civilians, which the commission report listed as a successful outcome and therefore did not devote much space to. He thought about 9 personnel. He thought about 11 days. He thought about the specific detail of Scraith carapace fragments in the recycling bay being sized and graded before processing, and a human noting this, and a human translating this observation into ammunition. "You have done this before," he said. It was not quite a question. She was quiet for a moment. "What specifically?" "Improvised, in the field. Constructed something from available components to fill a capability gap." The quiet was longer this time, not evasive. She was not trying to avoid the question. She was deciding how much of the answer was relevant and how much was unnecessary, which was a different thing. "Before I was auxiliary," she said at last, "I spent 4 years as a civilian logistics coordinator on Rigel Station. Supply chain disruptions, infrastructure gaps. You learn to work with what's present rather than what the request form says should be present. That is not military training." "No," she agreed. "It's older than that." A pause. "Logistics teaches you to see what something can do, not what it was designed to do. After a while, the distinction stops being interesting. What matters is whether it works." Drivak pulled the form back toward him and looked at it without reading it. The photograph of the weapon sat at the top right corner. He had been avoiding looking at it directly for the past several minutes because each time he did, the part of his mind that processed threat evaluation offered him an assessment he did not want. The assessment was, in approximate translation, this individual looked at a food appliance, medical tubing, recycled enemy components, and a broken targeting site, and built something that anchored 3 defensive actions over 11 days and evacuated 4,600 civilians alive. She did this under active threat, with no external support, in 11 days. What does she build if you give her a machine shop and a month? He did not want the answer to that question. He recognized, sitting with the form in front of him and the human across the table watching him with perfect tranquility, that not wanting the answer was a separate question from whether he needed it. "The Commission," he said, "will be issuing its ruling this standard week. The weapon itself will remain confiscated. The Varaxian Consul's framework scope argument will receive a formal response." "I understand." "The formal response," he said, choosing his words with the care he usually reserved for diplomatic communiques, "will likely require several more weeks of interdepartmental review." He set the form down. "During which time, the engagement classification on your service record remains provisional." She looked at him. The transport is late expression gave way for a moment to something that might have been amusement, or might have been a very specific form of patience that looked like amusement from the outside. "That's a long time for a provisional classification." "The Commission moves carefully," he said, "on matters with significant precedent implications." She nodded. "Once, then, the weapon they confiscated was the 3rd version." Drivak's lower hands, folded under the table, went very still. "The 1st version used a different actuator," she said conversationally, as if this were a detail from the same logistics manifest she'd been reading earlier. "It had a cycling problem at pressure above 900 kilopascals. I scrapped it on day 6. The 2nd version corrected the cycling issue, but the aperture caused fragmentation problems with the carapace material. Inconsistent flight path beyond 60 meters. I rebuilt the aperture housing on day 8. The 3rd version was the one that worked." She looked at him with that steady calm. I mention this because the confiscated weapon is version 3 of a construction process I now understand completely. In the corridor outside, the Solvati maintenance crew had finished their diagnostics. The lights returned to normal, and the corridor was quiet. Drevak sat with this information for a careful moment. "You're telling me," he said, "that confiscating it has not removed the capability." "I'm telling you the capability is information," she said. "Not hardware." He stood up. She stood up across from him. The room was very quiet, in the way that only rooms with good sound insulation and complicated recent events tended to be. "I'll have my review clerk send you the commission's preliminary timeline," he said. "Thank you, Assessor." She picked up the small travel case she'd brought in with her. Standard transit luggage, entirely ordinary, nothing that would flag a scan, and walked to the door. At the door, she stopped. He had the distinct impression she had planned to say something and was deciding whether it needed to be said. "Assessor," she said, "when the commission reviews the framework scope question, a beat. You might look at the HFY compact resolutions from the 3rd expansion period. There's a section on adaptive field implementation that didn't make it into the current joint framework because the Vraxian delegation found it procedurally inconvenient at the time." She held the door. "The HFY wrote it because they had been in a situation similar to mine. They lost the argument because they didn't have 4,600 evacuated civilians to point to." A pause that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. "I do." She left. The door closed with a soft, sealed click. Drevak stood for a moment in the recycled air silence of the hearing chamber. Then, he sat back down. Then he pulled up the commission's documentation index on his datapad and opened a search window. He typed, HFY Compact, 3rd expansion period, adaptive field implementation. The results came back in 4 seconds. The relevant section was 47 pages long, written in the characteristically dense procedural dialect of HFY administrative law, buried in a subchapter titled Resource Substitution in Non-Standard Engagement Contexts. He had never seen it before. He was quite certain the consul's office had never seen it either. He read the first page, then the second. By the 5th page, he had a very specific understanding of what had just happened in this hearing room, and it was not what he had expected when he walked in this morning with 17 prior hearings behind him and a form in his hands. The commission had convened this session to assess whether Auxiliary Kowalski had violated the joint engagement framework by constructing an unauthorized weapon. This was the framing. He had accepted the framing. He had run the hearing inside the framing. She had walked in, waited for him to finish presenting the framing, and then handed him a 47-page HFY document that did not merely complicate the framing, but systematically replaced it with a different legal architecture, one that had been sitting in the secondary archives of the compact resolution records for 60 standard years because nobody had ever needed it badly enough to find it. He thought about the logistics coordinator sitting in a recycling bay on a besieged transit station, watching Scraith fragments run through a sizing sorter, thinking about aperture geometry and actuator pressures and cycling rates. He thought about what that kind of thinking looked like, applied to something other than a food appliance, applied to the commission's framework, applied to 60 years of archived administrative law that happened to contain exactly the argument she needed. The assessment his threat evaluation mind had offered him earlier about the machine shop and the month quietly returned. He did not dismiss it this time. 3 weeks later, the commission published its ruling. The confiscated weapon was classified as an improvised field resource constructed under the HFY compact framework, not a prohibited munitions system. The The joint engagement framework was referred back to the full commission for revision, with specific attention to what the published ruling called adaptive capability provisions for non-standard operational contexts. The Vraxian consul filed a counter-protest. The counter-protest was assigned to a review committee with a 22-week standard timeline. 6 days after the commission ruling, Drivak received a message from auxiliary Kowalski. It was brief, professional, and contained a single file attachment. The file was a schematic. Not the weapon. Not version 3. Something else entirely, drawn in precise technical notation on recycled data paper, annotated in the margins in handwriting that moved quickly but never lost precision. It covered 2 sheets. The accompanying message read, "For the revised framework committee. Thought this might be useful context. It's version 1 of something I've been working on. I'm told Terran Station has a proper machine shop now." Below that, a second line. They're also getting a full auxiliary complement. 24 personnel. I put in for the posting. Drivak sat with this schematic for a long time. He did not fully understand what he was looking at, because it was not a weapon he recognized, and he was not, ultimately, an engineer. What he understood was the density of the notation, the number of marginal revisions, the specific way the annotations moved from problem statement to proposed solution without visible hesitation. The handwriting of someone who did not find this difficult, who found it interesting in the way that a familiar and satisfying problem was interesting. He understood the version number. Version 1. He thought about what version 3 looked like, given that version 3 of the previous project had anchored 11 days of defensive action against Scraith combat drones. He understood that Terran Station was getting 24 auxiliary personnel and a machine shop and auxiliary Kowalski, and that these 3 things together represented a combination he was not entirely sure the joint engagement framework had anticipated. He was not entirely sure the Galaxy had anticipated it. He filed the schematic under the Adaptive Capability Provisions docket, added a personal notation flagging it for senior review, and sat back in the chair. Outside the window, the station corridor lights ran their normal cycle. Somewhere in the transit system, a logistics coordinator who was also a soldier and also, apparently, an engineer was probably already on a transport, already looking at the departure gate, with the particular expression of someone whose travel arrangements were proceeding exactly as planned. He was almost glad she was going somewhere else. He forwarded the schematic to the committee that afternoon and wrote a cover note that took him 4 drafts, because the first 3 were too alarmed, the 4th was too measured, and he could not quite find the register that accurately represented what he actually felt, which was something between very deep respect and the quiet, persistent awareness that he was standing at the edge of something he could not fully see. He settled on a 5th draft. It said, "This comes from a source with demonstrated capability in adaptive field engineering. Recommend priority review." He did not mention Terran Station. The committee had the engagement records. Anyone who needed to understand the context of the recommendation could read them. He sent the message. Then he closed the docket and opened the day's other filings, which concerned maintenance schedules and transit routing adjustments and a personnel dispute in the Northern Corridor Administration Office, all of which were problems he understood completely and could resolve without sitting afterward in a silence that felt slightly larger than the room. This did not entirely work. But the maintenance schedules were detailed and required his full attention, and by the 3rd page, the silence had settled into something more manageable, the way a sound eventually settles when you stop listening for it. In his private notes, which he kept in a secured personal log separate from the Commission's records, he wrote one additional entry that he would not include in any official filing. He wrote it in his own dialect. The way he wrote things meant only for himself. And it said, translated roughly, the human brought the legal framework that overturned her own case to the hearing at which she was being tried. She had it ready. She waited for the hearing to be presented before producing it, which means she understood that producing it before the hearing would have allowed the consul's office to prepare a counter. She waited until the consul's framework argument had been formally introduced, and then she answered it. This is not engineering. This is something else. I do not have a clean category for it. He closed the log. He went back to the maintenance schedules. Outside, the station ran its ordinary operations, and somewhere in the transit network, a transport departed on time, carrying a passenger who had already read the arrival terminal's facility specifications and was probably thinking, in the particular way she thought about things, about what was available and what it could be made to do. The transit routing adjustments took him until the middle of the afternoon. The personnel dispute in the northern corridor took longer because personnel disputes always did, because they involved people who had feelings about their situations, and feelings were not efficiently resolved by documentation alone. He scheduled a mediation session, assigned a neutral facilitator from the general staff, and noted in the record that the parties had agreed to a preliminary cooling period. This was the correct procedure. It was also, he thought, a very clean example of a problem that stayed inside its framework, that did not quietly rewrite the framework while appearing to comply with it. He thought about Auxiliary Kowalski one more time before the end of his shift. Not about the hearing itself, but about the moment she had left and the specific quality of her stillness at the door. The pause, the deliberation, the choice to speak rather than not speak. He had been in enough adversarial proceedings to recognize the difference between someone who had information they were not sure they needed to share and someone who had information they had already decided to share and was simply timing the delivery. She had been doing the second thing. The pause was not hesitation. It was placement. This was a distinction that mattered. Hesitation was a gap in planning. Placement was execution. He added a second entry to his private log, much shorter than the first. It said, "Request posting assignment for Auxiliary Kowalski from Terran Station after initial deployment period. 12 months. Review at end of cycle." He paused, then added, "Do not assign to commission review work. Assign to field operations." He did not fully explain this recommendation to himself in the log, but the reasoning was not complicated. The commission was built to assess things that could be assessed, to apply frameworks that existed to situations that fit inside them. What he had spent 4 hours today doing was attempting to assess something that did not fully fit inside any framework he had. And the assessment had concluded, correctly he thought, that the thing he was assessing was the source of its own framework. This was not a commission problem. This was a field problem. More precisely, it was the kind of problem that resolved itself if you put the right person in the right place and then made sure the machine shop was adequately supplied. He closed the log for the second time and finished the last form on the afternoon's stack, which was a routine equipment transfer request from the station's Eastern Service Corridor. Thermal cycling units from the catering system, scheduled for replacement as part of the quarterly maintenance rotation. Standard form. Standard routing. He processed it without incident and moved to the next item. He did not note the thermal cycling units in any of his active dockets. There was no reason to. They were going to storage, properly cataloged, under standard replacement protocol. Nothing about them was irregular. He did register, briefly and privately, that he had looked at a food appliance entry on a routine maintenance form and found himself thinking about actuator pressures and aperture geometry for approximately 3 seconds before the thought resolved and dispersed. He supposed, somewhat dryly, that this was what it looked like when someone changed the way you thought about things. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but in the small, persistent way of water through a seal. Gradual, thorough, eventually very hard to reverse. He approved the transfer request. He filed the last form. He stood, stretched his secondary appendages, and walked out of the hearing chamber into the ordinarily lit corridor where the maintenance work was finished and everything was functioning correctly, and the lights ran their normal cycle with no particular feeling attached to them at all. He had 7 more hearings on the schedule for the following standard week. 3 were routine. 2 were moderately complex. 1 was a contract dispute that had been escalating for 6 months and would likely require a full commission panel. 1 was a decommissioning review. The 7th was a follow-up assessment for a case he had referred to the adaptive capability provisions docket, pending the full committee review. He looked at it for a moment. Then he moved it to the end of the week's schedule rather than the beginning, which was, he recognized, something between professional caution and what a human might have called, in the particular deadpan way they seemed to use for most observations about themselves, covering his bets. He went home. The station ran its ordinary operations around him, lights and corridors, and the low, constant hum of systems that were working as intended. And somewhere, in the quiet of that ordinary functioning, the committee review was open, and the schematic was filed, and a transport was in transit, and version 1 of something was already drawn, annotated, and waiting. He thought once, just before sleep. She said, version 1. Then he stopped thinking about it, because the alternative was not sleeping at all, and he had 7 hearings in the morning, and he needed to be present for all of them. He was almost sure he was prepared for them. He was almost sure. He was almost certain, and almost was the word he kept returning to, because the Commission's entire operational philosophy rested on the premise that certainty was achievable through proper process, sufficient documentation, and the correct application of established frameworks. He had believed this for 22 years of service. He still believed it for the maintenance schedules, the transit routing, the personnel disputes, the decommissioning reviews. He believed it for 17 different types of hearing. He was learning that there might be an 18th type for which the premise required adjustment. The Adaptive Capability Provisions Committee met for the first time 12 days later. Drivak attended as an observer, which was not his usual role, but which the committee chair had welcomed on the grounds that he had originated the docket referral and might be useful for context. He sat in the back row of the committee chamber, a larger and more formally arranged room than his own hearing space, with tiered seating for the 7 committee members, and a presentation table at the front where the relevant documentation was laid out in neat categorical order. The Hivani compact materials were in a separate stack on the left. They were 47 pages and an additional 11 pages of supplementary resolution text that one of the junior clerks had located in the archive records 2 days after the initial search, which meant the Hivani provisions were actually 58 pages, and the original 47 that auxiliary Kowalski had directed him to were the core argument rather than the complete one. He had not been surprised to learn this. She had given him the part he needed for the immediate situation. Whether she had read the remaining 11 pages was not a question he found himself able to answer with confidence in either direction. The committee chair, a Kaldrathi senior assessor named Virith, opened the session by summarizing the case record and the schematic filing. She read from a prepared summary, her bioluminescent markings running a steady neutral gray that indicated professional attention rather than any particular emotional valence. When she reached the section covering the weapon's construction timeline, two of the committee members exchanged a look that he recognized across the chamber as the specific look of people who had read the same document and arrived at the same conclusion independently. The conclusion, he suspected, was 3 versions in 11 days. The technical consultant the committee had brought in for the schematic review, a Solvati engineer with 3 decades of field systems experience, had already filed a preliminary assessment. Drivak had read it that morning. It was 4 pages long, and its final paragraph, written in the direct clinical style of Solvati technical documents, said, "The schematic under review represents a functional propulsion and delivery system capable of integration with standard auxiliary operational platforms. The design philosophy reflects iterative refinement under resource constraints and demonstrates familiarity with multi-system component interaction that is not typical of single-discipline training." The annotation style suggests the designer works from first principles rather than from established design protocols. This is unusual in submitted schematics and is noted. Unusual. Drivak had read that word 3 times. The committee spent 2 hours on the HFY compact provisions. They spent another 90 minutes on the existing joint engagement framework and the specific clauses that the consul's original protest had cited. At the end of this discussion, Vereth summarized the committee's preliminary consensus, which was that the HFY provisions were applicable, that the framework required revision, and that the revision should incorporate specific language around what she termed adaptive resource utilization in non-standard operational contexts, which was a cleaner version of the same concept auxiliary Kowalski had used in the hearing. The Varaxian consul's representative, present as an observer, registered a formal objection. Vereth noted the objection and moved to the next agenda item. Drivak watched this happen from the back row and felt the particular satisfaction of watching a framework argument that had been introduced as a weapon turned around and aimed in a different direction entirely, which was not the same as watching it fail, but was in some ways more useful, because failure ended the argument and turning it around continued it in a more productive direction. He thought about version 1 of the schematic sitting in the docket file. He thought about version 3 of the weapon, which had existed as a concept, then a first attempt, then a corrected second attempt, then a functional third attempt, and was now confiscated hardware sitting in an evidence locker on the commission's lower level. He thought about the fact that the hardware and the capability were, as she had noted, different things. He had been in logistics himself, briefly, at the start of his career. Not field logistics, administrative coordination, the kind that happened in offices and concerned itself with forms and timelines and the movement of materials through established channels. He had been good at it. He had moved from it to assessment work because assessment suited his mind more precisely. The weighing of competing considerations, the application of existing frameworks to new situations, the determination of where a situation fit within the established order. He had been, he thought, imagining a narrower range of situations than apparently existed. Vereth called the committee session to a close at 3 hours and 40 minutes, which was efficient by commission standards. The preliminary findings would be drafted over the following week, reviewed by the full commission at the next cycle, and transmitted to the Joint Engagement Framework Secretariat for incorporation into the revision process. Estimated timeline for the complete revision: 4 standard months. 4 months. He thought about what version 2 of the schematic might look like in 4 months, given version 1's current state, and then deliberately stopped thinking about it because the committee chamber was now clearing, and he had a transit routing review to attend. He stood. The Solvati technical consultant was gathering his materials at the front of the room and glanced up as Drevak passed. "The schematic," the consultant said with the directness that was characteristic of his species in professional settings. "Do you know who submitted it?" "Yes," Drevak said. The consultant looked at him for a moment. His bioluminescent markings ran a brief yellow-amber pattern, the Solvati tell for professional interest. "Are they available for consultation? I have questions about the aperture geometry in Section 3 that the annotations don't fully address." Drevak considered this. "She's been posted to Terran Station," he said. "I believe there's a communication protocol through the Auxiliary Operational Hub. The station is getting a new machine shop." The consultant's markings ran amber again, brighter this time. "Understood," he said, and went back to his materials. Drevak walked out of the committee chamber into the corridor. The lights were running normally. Somewhere, the transit network was moving people between stations, cargo through hubs, information through the ordinary channels of galactic administration. 4,600 people who had been on Terran Station during the engagement were somewhere in the galaxy doing whatever they had been going to do before the Scraith came through the docking arms, because a logistics coordinator with a broken carbine and access to a recycling bay had spent 11 days building things from whatever was available. He had one more form to file before the routing review. It was a standard posting confirmation, routine administrative traffic, the kind of document that moved through the system without anyone noticing it particularly. He filed it from his handheld while walking, which was not ideal form but was efficient, and the system acknowledged receipt in 2 seconds. The posting confirmation was for Terran Station. 24 auxiliary personnel. Full complement effective immediately. He had added a single annotation to the form in the notes field that most people left blank because it rarely mattered. Machine shop operational status. Confirm inventory and supply chain capacity. Report to Ops Coordinator on arrival. He did not specify what the Ops Coordinator might want to do with the machine shop inventory once the status was confirmed. He thought, with what was becoming a familiar combination of professional clarity and unquantifiable unease, that specifying this would probably be unnecessary. The routing review was in a small room 3 corridors down, and it concerned transit capacity projections for the coming quarter, which was a subject he understood completely and could address with full confidence and no residual uncertainty of any kind. He walked toward it at a measured pace, carrying the quiet knowledge that somewhere at the edge of the transit network, in a station that now had 24 personnel and a functional machine shop and an ops coordinator who thought in first principles and worked from what was available rather than what was supposed to be there, version 1 was already drawn, and versions 2 and 3 had not yet been asked for.